came to do a recital, more or less, on Harry Truman. And I was really spellbound by it when I got into all the history. I have done this report before, but every time you do something, new things come up. And since we're all women here today, and we love love stories, don't we? Truman had the greatest love story, Truman and Bess. I just thought it was so beautiful. They met. I'm going to start with Bess, because to understand Harry, you really have to understand Bess and what their relationship was. Bess was born in Independence, Missouri, 1985, and she was evidently a beautiful child. She had sparkling blue eyes. Harry, her husband, called her hair golden. She had golden curls. And they met in Bible study. He was 6 and she was 5. They saw one another off and on for years, but she really didn't want much to do with him in a romantic manner because he was a scrawny little guy. At that time, he was 5'8". He wore glasses from the time he was 6 years of age. And when he was 9, he and his brother developed diphtheria. And it affected him so badly that he was paralyzed for a period of time. And at age 9, his mother had to put him in a baby buggy and push him around. I don't know how long it took before he was able to walk again, but he started out life in a hard manner. He really wanted to get into sports, but he couldn't because of his glasses and because he was kind of a tiny man, I guess, in those days. He couldn't get into football or anything like that. And Bess was so tuned into sports. She loved sports. She played tennis, she played basketball, she did all kinds of things. She was very gifted young woman, very beautiful, and sought by many admirers. When she was 18, her father killed himself. He went in the bathtub and he just shot himself in the head. And she was so shocked. She never got over that. You can just imagine what a terrible thing that would be. And she loved him so much. She looked like her dad. He, too, had blue eyes and blonde hair. And I think what happened to him, I think he got into gambling, and the debts overcame him. He couldn't handle it, and so he chose to take his own life. So for many years, Bess kept herself away from most people. She was very sociable, but she did not want any close attachments because she'd been hurt so badly. Well, Harry followed her around as much as he could, and his family had hard times too. They had a farm in Lamar, Missouri, and that's where he grew up. He spent 10 years of his life working on his dad's farm. And he got very wiry and very strong, very tan. And one day he went to her door to see her again. They lived miles and miles apart. And he went to visit a family member who lived close to her home. And they had been given a cake by her mother. And he brought the cake back. And when he brought the cake plate back to the door, Bess answered. And when she saw him, he appealed to her then because he looked very, muscular and tan and healthy, and they started talking, but it took a long time for him to talk her into marriage. Her father was dead, and she had to take care of her mother. I told you what happened to her father, and so she didn't want a relationship with a man at that time. So years went by, and she would allow Harry to come and to visit her, And then after a while, when he worked on his dad's farm, he was able to buy a car, and he would drive 60 miles to visit her. She was his life from the time he met her when they were little children. I thought that was so beautiful, even though she didn't realize that until years later. But he even had a tennis court built on his property, hoping that she would come there and play tennis. He did everything he could to intrigue her. They finally got married when he was 35 and she was 34. That was about 30 years of loving somebody. So you know that he loved her so passionately with all his heart. Her mother was a very domineering woman, and she couldn't leave her mother for all those years. That was part of the reason they didn't get married. When they did get married, she got pregnant. She lost her baby. Then she got pregnant again, and she lost that baby. She got pregnant a third time, and she said, I am not going to get any baby furniture or clothing. I'm not going to do a thing. So when their baby was really born, and that was Margaret, who's a very famous woman too, because of her parents, she had to put her in a dresser drawer to sleep for a while because they had no furniture for her. The mother, Bess's mother, lived with them for about 30 years. Can you imagine that? And she did not like Harry. None of that time did she care about him. She thought he was a loser. He'd never make anything of himself. Can you just imagine that after what he achieved? So maybe all of this hostility pushed him on to become the man that he became. Because sometimes when you have a little tension behind you like that, it helps you to get a move on. Anyway, you know the story of their daughter, Margaret. Harry was a pianist. He loved to play the piano. He loved music. He loved literature. His favorites were Shakespeare and Charles Dickens. And he read everything that Mark Twain wrote. So, you know, he read all the classics. He was very interested in government during this time. And so he would get involved with community things that were government related. He became a senator. He was a senator for 10 years. And during that time, Bess still lived in the Independence, Missouri area with her mother and their daughter. Bess hated notoriety. She didn't want to be in the government. He couldn't afford to buy a home for them there. And so they would have had to live, I guess, in an apartment. Her mother would have to be there. It just seemed too confusing, so they didn't go to be with him. At that time, he made $15,000 a year for being a senator. Later, when he became president of the United States, he made $75,000 a year. Now that's a mere pittance now. I think the president makes a couple $100,000 a year now. But anyway, and they when he was president, they also had to buy all their own food, which is surprising to me. Things have changed a lot through the years. Well, now I'll talk a little bit more about Harry, who's the topic of our conversation. As you all know, Harry Truman was the 33rd president of the United States, and he was born in 1884 in Lamar, Missouri. His name is Harry S. Truman, and people have always wondered what the S stood for. It stands for nothing. Both his grandfathers had a given name that started with S, and they both wanted him named after them. The parents couldn't do it for both men, of course, so what they did, they just put an S in the middle of his name. I thought that was kind of interesting, because people always want to know, what does the middle name, what does that stand for? He tried to attend college, but he really didn't have the money. He attended business college after high school, and he got a job as a timekeeper for a railroad construction company. He worked as a clerk, and he made $100 a month. That was good money at that time. Then, as I told you, he moved to a farm, and he worked on that farm for 10 years, where he became very strong and robust. And he still had not found his life's work at age 38, and he was asked to run for the Democratic Party as a candidate for the Eastern Judge of Jackson County. So he was a judge also for a period of time. So many people aren't aware of his background, but he did have a basic background in law enforcement, and he was a Democrat from the very beginning. In those days, Democrats were very popular, I think because of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for one reason. He did so much for our country. Now, here's something that was kind of interesting. Once during the 1930s, a newsreel crew tried to record on camera one of the rare speeches by Senator Truman. They became so exasperated with his mumbling and bumbling, and after several retakes, the cameraman shouted, "Senator, speak up!" And when the crew left, Truman heard one of the men say in disgust, "He ain't no Roosevelt, is he?" He couldn't compete with Roosevelt, but they were so different. They both had their own areas of expertise. He was, as I said, he was average in appearance and height. He spoke with a flat, twangy Missouri accent, and he wore thick glasses. No one was ever impressed by his appearance or his personality. He had a good grasp of history, but no college degree. And then that was when he determined to become a senator. He became one of the leaders of the Senate. He was there for 10 years. With the outbreak of World War II in Europe in 1939, Truman gained national attention as the chairman of a committee that was investigating defense contracts. And these were such terrible times for our country. We entered into war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And that was the day that Roosevelt said on his speech, "This day will go out into infamy." He said it was December the 7th, 1941. And then 3 days later, December the 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. So, on our western side, we'd been attacked, and so many of our servicemen killed by the Japanese. On the East Coast, Germany and Europe and Italy were going to come over and invade our country. In those days, our country united. It was amazing to see, and people nowadays could not begin to visualize how people pulled together, how Americans really cared for one another. And we did so many things to help one another and in the war effort. Victory gardens were planted. I remember that if you had a stick of gum, if you were lucky enough to get a stick of gum, which was hard to get, and you'd take the wrapper, the aluminum foil, and roll it into a ball. And people would put them together and roll balls and balls, and they would be turned in, and they could be used in the war effort. Defense factories were formed here. Some of my mom's nieces were part of the defense system here in the St. Louis area. They were making ammunition, they were rolling bandages, they were doing everything. People had victory gardens so that you could provide for your family, and so more food could go to our troops overseas. You had these coupons that you could get flour and sugar. It wouldn't pay for it, but it entitled you to take that coupon to the grocery store with your money and get a bag of flour. Now, you only got it maybe once a month or whatever. It was sugar, flour, tobacco, hosiery, different things like that, that the government would issue out little coupons because we were sending so much of what we had to our military overseas. And the people of America all cared so much about one another. If a serviceman was wounded or killed, something would be hanging on their door to let the neighbors and people know that their family had someone in the military, that they had been wounded, they had been killed. My uncle was wounded in France, and when he came home, he had a terrible limp. He'd been in the hospital for months. It affected his whole life. And we forget sometimes about how the servicemen that do come home, some of them are so badly injured that they are never the same. Some have lost arms and legs. And anyway, during this time, our country was so cognizant of what we were giving, what we had to give, and love for other people, and determined to win the war. President Roosevelt was an incredible president, and he was president at such a hard time. But as you know, he had polio. He developed polio when he was younger. And then when he was older, he got terribly ill due to his heart and lungs. And he would go to Warm Springs or someplace like that to try to swim in warm water. Then he would come back to the country and give it his all. Truman was nominated as vice president for Roosevelt. And he really didn't want to be vice president. He had been a senator for 10 years. He enjoyed that, but he didn't want this part of the government because he knew what it would mean to his family, too. He knew Bess hated it. She hated any kind of social activity of that sort. So he was nominated, but during the 11 weeks he was vice president, he met with the president only one time. I guess so much was going on that he really wasn't made aware of everything that the president knew. And one of the things that the president knew was that we had the atomic bomb and that we could use that against our enemies in war. FDR had been stricken with polio when he was younger. Now he suffered from a severe heart condition and high blood pressure. And his advisors knew that he couldn't live much longer. Come in. He passed away. When he passed away, and Truman realized that he was the new president, he said, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen in on me." He asked people to pray for him because he didn't know how he could begin to handle such a monumental job. The U.S. troops were liberating Paris from Germans. At that time, just 8 months before the death of Roosevelt, Germany surrendered on May 7th, 1945, 3 weeks after Truman took office. You can imagine all of this going on. You've got this new position. You haven't really been fully informed about it. He had to have divine guidance to do what he did. Roosevelt had been president since 1933, and when he died in 1945, the whole nation felt as though the world had come to an end. I remember as a young schoolgirl walking on the street to go to school. I don't know how old I was, but someone hollered across the street and said, "Oh, did you hear? Did you hear? Roosevelt just died." Well, at that age, I didn't even know who Roosevelt was. But the whole country was so devastated because they loved him so much. And as I said, he was in his fourth term, but he just couldn't. He couldn't make it any longer. He had a heart attack and died. Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife, was the one who told Truman about her husband's death. And Truman was so shocked, and he asked Eleanor if there was anything he could do for her. And she said, "Is there anything we can do for you? You are the one in trouble now." And that was certainly true, wasn't it? He was in trouble. He was following a man who had been president longer than any other president. Many people couldn't even remember another president. He'd been in for so long. And they were so different. FDR was a refined, educated man, very knowledgeable, and Harry was a blunt, outspoken person from Missouri, the show-me state. And that's what he did. He went into government, he became president, and he showed people who he was and what he could do. But the beauty of it was he never took credit for all the things he had done, really. I think he gave God the credit because he knew with such monumental things on his plate, he couldn't begin to handle it by himself. Now, Bess could not live up to Eleanor Roosevelt either. It said she couldn't even christen a boat properly. She tried one time to christen a boat, and she hit the ship 9 times with the champagne. The bottle would not break, and she gave up. She did not want to be involved in all the government attractions and so on. Harry, though, attracted the most attention now. Although his personality seemed very unaffected by his new position, he continued to talk. He loved to take long walks, and he played the piano. He was a very good pianist. His daughter, Margaret, was a concert soloist. And sometimes he played golf, and then sometimes he drank bourbon with his buddies. Occasionally, he would be angered by some comment on the radio or newspaper, and he would write an angry letter to the person, and then he got over it. So he expressed himself. His management style was his very own. He met weekly with the entire cabinet, something Roosevelt had rarely done. Roosevelt wanted power in his own hands, where Truman knew that the power was his, but he wanted to share it. He wanted things to be done properly. And he did what I guess is called networking. Instead of trying to find out everything yourself, he did networking. And he worked with the government people and whoever could give him information, and he acted accordingly. Then he had a terrible, terrible decision to make, and we all know about that. Now, I was surprised when I just read about this last night, and I wasn't aware of that. The atomic bomb was dropped 4 months after Truman became president, and the war still basically went on all that time. The Japanese kamikaze pilots were still wrecking things. They were killing themselves for the glory of God, their God and country. And even though they had done this at Pearl Harbor and we were protecting our borders, they were still doing things all over the world that were terrible. And they were determined to get and conquer America. And Truman realized that they had to do something and do it quickly. So 4 months after that point, Truman ordered the atomic bomb to be lowered in Nagasaki, to be dropped. And more than 40,000 people there died and 60,000 were wounded. And we found out later about the dangers of radiation, and that the people that were anywhere in the area were probably affected their whole life because of the radioactivity. He dropped another one in Hiroshima. So that was twice. At that point, the Japanese emperor gave up. He signed the peace treaty. Now, Truman had tried to get him to sign the peace treaty before that time for quite a while, for 4 months evidently, and he would not do that. He just kept on. They were determined that they were going to take over America and, of course, then the world. This was the hardest thing that man ever had to do. And I can't imagine it. If I had done that, I would think I would have nightmares every night. I don't know how it affected him emotionally, but I know that he had to keep going because he still had to work with America. They worked with Russia to a degree, and Truman had a meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Molotov. Their tactics and attempt to agree caused Truman to denounce Russia's tactics. Molotov said, after their conversations, whatever, Molotov said, "I have never been talked to like that in my life." And Truman said, "Carry out your agreements and you won't get talked to like that." He was such a blunt man. There was no finesse with him. He just came out with whatever he felt, whatever seemed right at the time. And I'm sure Molotov, that was that. There were no more talks. And they said that was the beginning of the Cold War with Russia. Prior to that time, I know that Franklin Delano Roosevelt met with Churchill and Stalin during the war years, and they tried to come to some kind of agreement. I don't know if anything really ever came of that or not. But at this point in time, Molotov was the foreign minister. And I've heard of Molotov cocktails. I didn't, relate the two until now. I don't. Molotov cocktail, does anybody know what that was? It seemed like a deadly thing, but I don't know if it was a drink or a bomb or what. Anyway, I'll have to look that up and let you know next time. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you very well. You need a mic. Oh, wine? Oh. I see. Could you hear what he said? He said you would put a fuse and I guess some kind of detonation in a wine bottle, and then you would light it and throw it. Is that how that worked? Yeah. Interesting. Okay, I don't have to look it up now. Thank you. After Japan surrendered, Truman had many, many more issues to deal with as far as U.S. foreign policies. The labor unions, John L. Lewis, Truman Marshall Plan, and the Marshall Plan was for the reconstruction of the parts in Europe that had been damaged so badly during the war. And to me, that is just what Americans are all about. Even though we go to war with someone and we destroy their things, when it's over, we try to help them and help them rebuild. It's not like we take a whip and crack them and say, "You are our servants now, da-da-da-da." I just find that fascinating. And I think that's why our country has continued to exist. This was during the Second World War. Truman was in the First World War, and he was in charge of a unit. They called it Battery D. I think he had 195 men under his command. Now, at that time, they didn't realize how bad his eyes were, so he was able to get into the Army. And he changed that unit dramatically. It said they were they were drinkers, they did all kinds of wild things, all these men. He shaped them in line, 195 men. So, I mean, he had some good practice, didn't he? Wow. Now, during the Korean crisis, North Korea was communist, is still communist. South Korea was not. They were at war with one another. We all know about the Korean War. And General Douglas MacArthur was the one who really did so much regarding those issues. And there was peace for a period of time. But then MacArthur, Chinese people got into it too, China. And MacArthur wanted to declare war on China. Truman said, absolutely not. And at that time, so many people in our country were really in tune with MacArthur, knowing all that he had done as a military man. You know what Truman did when MacArthur wouldn't give up his idea of going against China? Anybody remember? He fired him. I mean, can you imagine what the country thought? You fired this top general, the one who's been helping us? But see, Truman, his ideas were so basic and yet so pure. He just went to the heart of the matter, took care of it, and evidently didn't look back. Now, the Trumans moved into the White House, and shortly after they moved in, they discovered that the floors there were very unsteady. In fact, one day, his daughter Margaret's piano went through the floor. So they had to move for a while. So for 3 years, they lived at a place across the way, which was called Blair House. And that's a place where I think friends of the president, people who come to visit, live, stay. They have that for them. But at this time, Truman and his family lived there. They did a lot of remodeling at that time. One thing I thought was kind of interesting was that their daughter Margaret bedroom was what's called the Lincoln bedroom. But it wasn't really Lincoln's bedroom. It was his study. But they call it the Lincoln bedroom now. Lincoln never did sleep in that room. I thought that was kind of interesting. The election came for the next season, and Dewey was the Republican nominee for president. And everyone knew, the whole country knew, Truman would not begin to make it in again. At that time, they didn't appreciate Truman the way he's been appreciated in later years. And that happened so often. So he went out on the road, Truman, and he went by train, and he campaigned all over the country. And I don't think Dewey did much of that because it was such a shoo-in for him. He was sure. In those days, they didn't have Air Force One. They didn't have a plane that would take the president wherever he wanted to go to campaign. You had to take the train, days and days of riding on a train going. I'm sure that was hard to do. And then to get out and have to campaign and try to turn the hearts of the people to you. I showed the ones who were in here first this article with a picture. And this was the day after the election. And the newspaper, the Daily Chicago Tribune, shows Truman holding up a newspaper that was published the next morning or the night before, probably. And it says, Dewey defeats Truman. And is he laughing? Look at that big chuckle on his face. He made it. He made it again. I thought that was really something. This paper I have was printed by the Post-Dispatch in 1919, but the picture is from that actual time period, of course. I think that's pretty much what I want to say. Oh, this shows something about Truman too, about his bravery and stamina. In 1950, two Puerto Rican nationalists walked up the steps of Blair House, and that's when he and his family were living there. They pulled out guns and began firing at the policemen and Secret Service. And in the next 3 minutes, 32 shots were exchanged. A policeman was wounded, another fatally shot, and one of the would-be assassins was dead and the other one wounded. Now, Truman was only a few feet away from where all this happened, taking his afternoon nap. Later, they tried to get him to take stricter precautions because he walked every day. He would not do, he said, I'm going to continue to take my walks. He said, a president has to expect these things. I mean, it's so blunt, so, down to earth, everything he said. He didn't seek pity. He just called a spade a spade. This I thought was kind of amusing. His daughter, Margaret, was an accomplished singer. She graduated from George Washington University, and she sang in concert in Constitution Hall in December of 1950. A music critic gave her a terrible review, which was published the next day in the Washington Post. And Harry Truman wrote the critic an equally scathing letter. And this is what Truman wrote to that critic. I have just read your lousy review. You sound like a frustrated man that never made a success, an 8-ulcer man on a 4-ulcer job, and all 4 ulcers working. I never met you, but if I do, you'll need a new nose and plenty of beefsteak and perhaps a supporter for down below. That's the way he was. Now, after Margaret did marry, I didn't follow up on her, but I know that she did marry after her father left the White House, and she presented her parents with 4 grandsons, which I know was so wonderful for them. During the last 3 years, now Truman did not run for the presidency again, because Bess had had just about all she could take of that. And so he retired, and he had 20 years of retirement. Quiet, I don't know how quiet, but retirement away from the president's office. He died at the age of 88 in his hometown in Missouri, and one of his favorite sayings was, do your duty, and history will do you justice. I just have one more thing that I would like to mention. Oh, I've got too many papers here. Well, I just typed this morning. There it is. Okay. President Harry Truman had the tremendous backbone and raw courage to recognize the new state of Israel on May 14th, 1948, just moments after David Ben-Gurion issued its Declaration of Independence. Truman went forward with the decision despite tremendous pressures, not only from the Arab world, but also from his Secretary of State, George C. Marshall. And they said Truman was probably influenced by his friendship with his former business partner, Eddie Jacobson, who was an ardent supporter of Zionism. Now, the United States of America, through Donald Trump, recognized the state of Israel recently by changing our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital on May 14th, 2018, exactly 70 years after President Truman recognized Israel as a state. I thought that was pretty monumental, and that will go down in history too. So thank you for requesting that I speak about Truman. I enjoyed it so much. And I know that most of you here know some things, if not a lot of things, about Truman and his family and the government. So if anyone would like to make a comment or ask a question, I'd be happy to hear it.
When did he use the phrase, "the buck stops here"?
He had that sign in his office all through his, I don't know where that came from originally, but to me, he was saying, whatever your problem is, right here, I'll take care of it. I hope that's what it meant, but I'm not sure.
I know they always refer to that, but I didn't know about the sign.
No, I don't know where it originated. I don't think it was his private saying. I think it came from somewhere else. I'll try to find that out and let you know next time. Anyone else?
And I don't know the names, and maybe you do. I remember vaguely that as he was coming up from the ranks, he was under the thumb of some really bad character, and he walked away from it. He just got out from under this guy, and he took the presidency. And I wish I could remember the story, but I know at one point he was involved with a lot of,
The lady behind you mentioned something like that this morning. You thought he was involved with the mafia in some way?
Well, in his working positions, he was working in a retail store in Kansas City.
Oh, yeah.
And so, getting to the basics of it, his political career actually, I think, started with his position in the retail stores, because Tom Prendergast was a very well-known mafia man in Kansas City. And my information that I'm relating to you today is what I learned as a student at Webster College. Tom Prendergast's niece was a sister of Loretto, and she was the monitor on my floor. And she was relating the story of how Harry worked in this store, and his political history began there, in the sense that he met a lot of clients and employees of the store who were involved, in a sense, with Tom Prendergast, and they pulled him into his, in other words, they were sort of helpful in getting him more known, so that his political career started basically in that area where the name got more associated. And so his connections, Kansas City-wise, were kind of with Prendergast and some of the mafia people and so forth. And of course, as time went on, the senator and so forth and so on. So in other words, he came from like Lamar, unknown, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But then in his position in the store as a retail clerk, basically everything started moving along that way. And so, long story short, I think his menial beginnings kind of started in that respect.
That's very interesting. I know that store you were speaking of was a dry goods store. And he had a partner whose name was Eddie Jacobson.
Yeah.
in that store. And maybe the man you're speaking of is the one who helped him get into politics.
Exactly. So in other words, in Tom Prendergast, who was a big mafia man, you know, the name and so forth, because those were the days when, say what you want, people got going, and such and so forth.
You can turn it off.
For
Turn
what
it off.
it's worth, the Prendergast